is African American History is American History. Welcome. I'm your host, Harlan Kearsley. This program's goal is to foster understanding, promote discussion, and expand knowledge through stories of historical events, bios of unsung heroes, as well as timely and relevant news stories which, hopefully, will paint a vivid picture of the effects of segregation, discrimination, and bigotry on the lives of both blacks and whites. Comparisons will be made between the many racially fractured periods of American history and what's going on right now. Throughout American history, violent protests by white extremists like the events at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, have been little more than a futile, last-ditch attempt to cling to their supremacy. Before the Civil War, life in the Antebellum South had been built on slavery. Much of the South's social order depended on the idea of white supremacy and black inferiority. Whites were considered fit for freedom and citizenship, while blacks were nothing more than chattel slave labor.
I have lived among Negroes all my life, and I am for this government with slavery under the Constitution as it is. I am for the government of my fathers with Negroes. I am for it without Negroes. Before I would see this government destroyed, I would send every Negro back to Africa, disintegrated and blotted out of space. Andrew Johnson, 17th President of the United States, February 26, 1863.
By 1865, still steeped in the violence of slavery, white Southerners could hardly imagine blacks being free, let alone be their equals. The many horrific events that took place during Reconstruction definitely slowed, but did not stop, America's long march toward equality.
I am a little uneasy about the abolishment of slavery in this district. Not but I would be glad to see it abolished, but as to the time and manner of doing it. What I did after very full deliberation and under a heavy and solemn sense of responsibility. I can only trust in God that I have made no mistake. Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, 1862.
Racial violence in the Reconstruction period took three major forms: urban riots, interpersonal fights, and organized vigilante groups. Several riots occurred in southern cities during Reconstruction. There were major riots in Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana in 1866. Lawrence, South Carolina in 1870. Colfax, Louisiana in 1873. Another in New Orleans in 1874. Yazoo City, Mississippi in 1875, and Hamburg, South Carolina in 1876. After the war, southern cities grew rapidly as the newly freed slaves flocked to urban centers. Cities became centers of Republican control. Now, it's important to point out that this was back when the Republicans were the party of liberals and abolitionists, while the Democrats were the conservative white supremacist party. It seems the party of Lincoln is much different today than it was back in 1865, especially when it comes to race. The arrival of black residents and the establishment of biracial politics rubbed white conservatives the wrong way. In nearly every conflict, white conservatives initiated violence in reaction to the Republican rallies or conventions or elections in which black men voted. The death tolls of these conflicts were very high, and the victims were overwhelmingly black. African Americans had fought hard for the Union victory. earning constitutional protections in the form of 3 amendments, including the right to vote. The passage of the 13th Amendment freed 4 million slaves. Congress also passed the 14th Amendment, making the former slaves citizens, and the 15th Amendment granting the right to vote to all male citizens. In addition, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which divided the South into 5 military districts. These events were met with violent opposition from white Americans.
Slavery, like all other great systems of wrong, founded in the depths of human selfishness and existing for ages, has not neglected its own conservation. It has steadily exerted an influence upon all around it, favorable to its own continuance, and today it is so strong that it could exist not only without law, but even against law. Custom, manners, morals, religion are all on its side everywhere in the South. And when you add the ignorance and servility of the ex-slave to the intelligence and accustomed authority of the master, you have the conditions not out of which slavery will again grow, but under which it is impossible for the federal government to wholly destroy it, unless the federal government be armed with despotic power to blot out state authority and to station a federal officer at every crossroad. This, of course, cannot be done, and ought not even if it could. The true way and the easiest way is to make our government entirely consistent with itself and give to every loyal citizen the elective franchise, a right and power which will be ever present and will form a wall of fire for his protection. Whatever may be tolerated in monarchical and despotic governments, no republic is safe that tolerates a privileged class or denies to any of its citizens equal rights and equal means to maintain them. What was theory before the war has been made fact by the war. Frederick Douglass, orator, writer, and statesman, 1866.
This is African American History is American History. In early May of 1866, whites massacred 46 African Americans in Memphis, Tennessee, the home state of then-President Andrew Johnson. A few weeks earlier, Johnson, a Democrat, vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau, meant to aid emancipated slaves. In February, he had vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which afforded federal protection to black Southerners. Congress overrode both of Johnson's vetoes. On July 30th, 1866, armed whites massacred 238 African-American Union Civil War veterans and their families who had convened for the Louisiana Constitutional Convention in New Orleans. In 1876, when former Confederate General Wade Hampton ran for governor of South Carolina, a white supremacist paramilitary terrorist group known as the Red Shirts worked to influence the election. They terrorized black Southern Carolinians. This included outright massacres of African Americans at Ellington and Hamburg. Republican Governor Daniel Chamberlain requested federal military assistance from President Ulysses S. Grant, but Grant declined for fear it would push voters away from the party on Election Day. Daniel Chamberlain would be the last Republican governor of South Carolina until 1974. The Reconstruction era of the United States ended not with a bang, but with a compromise. The Compromise of 1877, to be exact. This was an unwritten deal, informally arranged among congressmen to settle an intensely disputed 1876 presidential election. It resulted in the federal government pulling the last troops out of the South and ending the Reconstruction era. The deal was that Republican Rutherford B. Hayes would be awarded the White House over Democrat Samuel J. Tilden, the then governor of New York and an anti-slavery Democrat who chose not to join the Republican Party. This was predicated on the understanding that Hayes would remove the federal troops protecting Republican state governments in South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Hayes received 185 electoral votes to Tilden's 184. Despite losing the election, Tilden won the popular vote. Under this compromise, Democrats who controlled the House of Representatives allowed the decision of the Electoral Commission to take effect. The outgoing president, Republican Ulysses S. Grant, removed the soldiers from Florida, and as president, Hayes removed the remaining troops from South Carolina and Louisiana. As soon as the troops left, many white Republicans also left, and the Democrats, who already dominated the other state governments in the South, took control. The black Republicans felt betrayed as they lost their power in the South that had been propped up by the federal military. And by 1905, most blacks were effectively disenfranchised by the now democratically elected state legislatures in every southern state. On March 31st, 1877, the Reconstruction era in the United States ended. In the South, a new racial and sadly legal system had been put in its place. A new dystopian era of black voter disenfranchisement and extreme racial segregation, which would continue throughout the South well into the late 1960s. This has been African American History is American History. The episode you've been listening to, Reconstruction, was written and directed by Harlan Kearsley. The voice actors for this episode, Jeffrey Shupert as Andrew Johnson and Abraham Lincoln, and Robert McKay as Frederick Douglass. I'm Harlan Kearsley, and on behalf of everyone here at African American History is American History, thank you for listening. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to the show. It's free, and once you do, you'll be notified as soon as new episodes are posted. Thanks again, and please, stay safe. African American History is American History. Copyright H.C. Kearsley, 2021.